Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I'm going to just begin, and you'll see that people are working to get the presentation started. But as I begin, first of all, let me give just my heartfelt thanks for the invitation from Andy and the congregation to come and come back home in some ways, the family of God. I have been here a number of times, you're going to hear about. But I count it a real privilege to come and share about what God is doing, His gospel, His global mission, because even though you're going to see my face and hear about my name and something about my life, but this is not about trying to bring glory and honor to Marsali Campbell. Those of you who know me, know that that would be so ridiculous. I'm here to bring glory and honor to God, our Father. This is also to encourage you and hopefully challenge you in the right sense, that if God can use somebody like Marsali Campbell in global mission, He can use each and every one of us. And I caveat the introduction again with the verse that I should decrease so that He would increase. Now I'm going to say something that can sound contradictory. I'm going to say that I'm not going to speak about God. That I'm not going to speak about myself, and then I'm going to speak about myself. I hope that you have some understanding as you're here today of who God is, what His gospel is, and what global mission actually is. I'm going to now speak about how God has used somebody like me, how He has given me blessings, including being brought up in the Free Church of Scotland, the Christian community. My late father was a Free Church minister in the Isle of Lewis. Some of you, Lewis is very familiar. Some of you who have come from different parts of the world, you may not know that to me and to others, it's the center of the world, it's the center of the universe. It's a beautiful island in the northwest of Scotland. We are from the Celtic people. My unusual name, Marsali, is from the Gaelic language of that Celtic people. It rhymes with parsley, if that is helpful with this weird name. I grew up with blessings that I took for granted. I was one of many privileged children and young people in our country to have access to education and health. I had shelter, I had protection. Looking at my size, you can tell I had enough food to eat and such like. I'm going to be speaking about children who are on the streets, and for many of us, it can seem unimaginable, and yet this is the challenge. It's not unimaginable to the hundreds of millions of children that are living on the streets in our world today, right now. But as I grew up in the island of Lewis, my father was called to the neighbouring island of Skye, to the village of Portree when I was 14. It's an important stepping stone in learning about calling and leading and guidance, because as Dad shared with us that God was calling him, I and my siblings told him, no, actually we don't want to follow God's leading and guidance there. We want to stay in our home, and we want to stay with our friends and our community. But thankfully Dad wisely instructed us and told us this is the Lord's will. Now then, I'm going to fast forward some years. If you're familiar with the term prodigal, I was a stereotypical, sadly, prodigal child of the manse who had the blessing of being brought up in a Christian home. But I went far from the Lord. My teenage years, I had no interest in the things of God. If my teenage self could see me, not just as a Christian, but someone sharing with you about God and Scripture and enthusing about Him, it would seem so ridiculous. But I speak of those years also, and into my early 20s. I went to Glasgow at the age of 18 And up to the age of 23, including those 5 years in Glasgow, I was simply far from the Lord. I had no interest in the things of God. But please keep praying for the prodigals within our families, my own family included still, and many in the room here. The way God brought me back to him was actually through a very godly, lovely, gentle minister called Mr. MacLeod, Donald MacLeod. He was called Donald the Dentist, so if people are familiar with the free church circles. It was a blue moon that found me at church that day because my sister was actually the Holy Joe. She was a member in Grand Street Free Church. And in the great way that many of our churches reach out, it was through food, the gospel of food, that I was attracted to the manse to have a nice dinner. But Mr. MacLeod drew close to me and actually using the Gaelic language, used a phrase that God used to come straight into my heart. So the spring of 1992, God used the very scripture I had known all through my life. He told me, do you know how much God loves you, Marsali? And I was like, yeah, kind of a bit like, I've heard this 10 million times. But it was slowly God warming this stubborn heart to hear in a new way. For God so loved Marsali that he gave his one and only son for Marsali. My mind was like, crumbs, that's huge. And then it was other scriptures. And actually, as the process was happening, we call this term the conviction of sin, where I was feeling like, oh, crap. Recognizing how amazing and majestic and creator God is, and what a mess I had made, and how awful and stubborn and rebellious I had been. But again, with great gentleness, Mr. MacLeod reminded me of Psalm 40. He said, Marsali, you're trying to get yourself out of the pit now. But Psalm 40 says that he lifts us from the pit. He puts our feet on a rock, and he gives us a new song to sing. So that opened what I call a cascade of therefores. So with those truths being true, and my mind being like, oh my goodness, God is amazing, and it was all that. Some people describe it, if you're familiar with the term, a road to Damascus. It was 180 degrees, and my life was like, oh, crumbs, I've got a lot to get right with God. So for the truths of God to be true and real, that therefore he has to be God of everything. And I realized in those moments that these were the seeds of global mission. He has to be God of my geography. I knew clearly that he was going to take me from Scotland. He has to be God of my finance. And if you know anything about nursing, most of us don't go into nursing to make lots of money. But there was a sense of this was my money, like my salary each month. And God gave me an image of just releasing that. Not in a careless way. We still have to steward finance and tithe, and there are biblical principles. But it was that he has to be God of all of these things. And he has to be God of my relationships. At the time, I was very much in love with somebody who was very special, but it was very clear that I had to end that relationship. But there was great joy in amongst that day. Now, in the introduction, I have to watch my time. God did take me away from Scotland, and again, in quite a dramatic way, the following year, he led me to work in South India. It was a volunteer Christian mission hospital in South India. I went there as a general adult nurse with surgical experience. Now, this is an important principle that God has done many times in my life, where he completely overwhelms me in either my professional capacity or in many ways in just my life. I was asked to take charge of the children's ward. I was overwhelmed with so much responsibility, the workload. India taught me many, many things that the truth of that he never leaves us and he never forsakes us. Now that can be in the darkest of the dark times. Even in the valley of the shadow of death, we will fear no evil, for he is with us. Because Isaiah 58, that I'm going to reference as well, speaks of God's light in the darkness. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat my time in India, because actually the more you would hear about it, it was deeply difficult. I was surrounded by the darkness of Hinduism, loving the people and loving the children, but there was a cholera outbreak not long after I had been there. And that also, the experience of the high mortality rate, mortality is another word for death, of children, was just too awful. It was so difficult. The following month that I was there, the second month I was there, we had an earthquake in the nearby state of Maharashtra. And some of you will remember the awful images recently of Syria and Turkey and earthquakes there. The devastation of that and the reality that we estimate thousands, maybe tens of thousands, people going into eternity like that. Lots of things were difficult about India, and yet it was such a training ground, an important stepping stone in global mission. To go where God leads you, not with the assumption that you're always going to like it. He does bring joy, he brings great joy, but the purpose is to serve him. And we don't go there also because we think we've got it all figured out, or no false humility. It's not that Marsali Campbell has all the answers either for the work ahead in Bolivia that you're hearing about, or about my time in Uganda. But these are important principles to encourage and also to challenge. And for those of you that have prayed for me for many, many years, know that to stand here before you is just an answer to prayer. God has preserved my life and kept me going and given me great joy and his strength. So after India, that was, God opened up, in some ways, a miraculous door for me to do postgraduate studies at Great Ormond Street Hospital, which is what took me to Cole Abbey at the time, this LCPC, the roots of this church. And that was important. These are important professional stepping stones. Also that God knew, of course, which is not rocket science, but God knew what was happening. We were reminded again by Andy, he works all things out, and he's preparing and providing. So I specialized in pediatric HIV and oncology as well, that's cancer, children with cancer. Not knowing that one day I would be working with children on the streets in sub-Saharan Africa, where HIV continues to devastate many communities in Africa and other places. But he gave me such unique privileges in study and work and experience. The next important stepping stone took me back to Scotland to work in Glasgow in pediatric casualty, accident and emergency department. I think my parents thought, like, oh, now, she's, if you know the Scottish term gallivanting, like you heard, gallivanting is finished. My dear mother in Portree thought that London felt as far away as India, so at least having me within the borders of Scotland seemed to reassure her. But an important part about Glasgow was not just professionally, but one of the first weekends that I was back in Glasgow, there was a couple, Hugh and Maureen McKenna, who were formerly homeless themselves and formerly alcoholics with drug and alcohol issues. They were looking for volunteers, well, two groups of volunteers. One was to help make soup and baking and those kind of things. Now, that's not my gifting whatsoever. I'm good at doing dishes or that kind of stuff, but nobody wants to eat my soup or burnt offerings, maybe. But the second group, they were looking for people just to come alongside them and work in. We had an old bus that was the base for the ministry that we would serve soup and sandwiches, but also have a very specific ministry to the prostitutes that worked around that area. Now, even using that term, people may, even with the best of intentions, we think we want to be caring and compassionate people. But I had never engaged in conversation with anybody that worked as a prostitute. But Maureen particularly really modeled the Paul and Timothy discipleship model, which is an older Christian and a younger Christian. And she often would ask me to kind of leave the bus and all that we were doing and just take a flask and go round and chat to some of these women. And that's literally what we did. And these are principles when people ask about how do we work on the streets of Glasgow or the streets of Kampala or ahead now to the streets of Bolivia. And some of it is not complicated. It's sitting alongside and seeing the humanity of each and every one of these girls. Maureen spoke to them as humans. She spoke to them as young women. She spoke to them about their health. She spoke to them about their children. She spoke to them about sometimes violent partners. She spoke to them about the benefit system or their housing. And she didn't ignore what was happening, because sometimes men would come and park and some of the girls would go off. But she wasn't judgmental. She was caring. She was compassionate. And so that training ground was very important. Then I move on to 20 years in Africa. And if you think this introduction has already been long, you think, oh, crumbs, when is she going to start talking about Bolivia? There's two things I'm going to mention about 20 years in Africa. I was called to serve God in Africa with Africa Inland Mission, AIM International. I would still commend that organization to you and the work that they continue to do for the Lord in the continent of Africa. I was asked to join a Ugandan team that was working. We were in the infancy of a ministry that became Dwelling Places. That's actually where we get our name, Isaiah 58, which I'm going to reference, but the ministry was called Dwelling Places. Ugandan Christians seeking to reach children on the streets, and I was asked to help develop the medical work, nursing and such like. But the two things I want to mention are, firstly, Rita Nkemba, who started the work. She spoke about when you work with children on the streets and young people on the streets, you need to have God's heart and his spirit, but also you need to have his hearing aids. So that she was very creative and very animated, and you're seeing a very poor reflection on her very animated, African, beautiful, creative way. But she spoke of how when you have God's hearing aids, you hear the noise, you hear sometimes the anger, and this resonates from Glasgow, because if you haven't heard, there was a lot of bad language or sometimes crude terms or just, but God can give you his hearing aids that you hear pain, you hear anger, you hear something of the fears that they have, or you hear something of the confusion and the very low self-esteem as well. But also that God can give us his glasses so that we see these people for who they are, particularly the children, that they have something of the divine in them. They are made in the image of God. Now, if you've ever had time to meet with people that feel that they are the lowest of the low, they have been told, for some of them, from their earliest memories, that they are the lowest of the low, like they are hopeless, useless, filthy, cursed, all of that. And you have the privilege to tell them about the love of God and that they are made in the image of God. It's so powerful, and it's such a blessing. And I'm so thankful that Rita taught me a lot about the basic humanity, but also the divine that is in each one of these precious children on the streets. Now, the second story is one example out of thousands that we have been able to help in the Ministry of Dwelling Places that also continues, and I again commend the Ministry of Dwelling Places for your prayers. Dan is now in his 30s. I, of course, still call him a boy. He's a lovely young man. He's married now. He has 4 beautiful children. His firstborn is called Marsali. I have an obvious bias. for that family. I never met another Marsali growing up in the Isle of Lewis or in the Highlands, and neither are little Marsalis running around sub-Saharan Africa. It's very, very bizarre. But I remember Dan as a 10-year-old on the streets, and if there was a stereotypical street kid, he was filthy, he was in rags, he was angry, he was fighting a lot, he was high on drugs. There's something they call injaga, which is a combination of street drugs. But again, as Rita and previously Maureen and actually my own mother, how she used to model, she has passed away now, but she modeled something of gentleness and kindness and those principles that the Lord can use. Dan was able to be rescued from the streets of Kampala. Through the Ministry of Dwelling Places, there's a physical cleansing that happens from day one. They get water and soap and clothes and food, some health, and then he has access to education. He was able to finish S6. He came to know the Lord. He came to know and really love the Lord and serve him. He struggled for many years with the principle of forgiveness, but he had received salvation, and over time God brought some deep healing into some of the darkest times. He had known awful witchcraft, and he had come from an Islamic background. The HIV had really impacted his polygamous family as well. It was really kind of messy and complicated. But God just took him. And actually, as I referenced Psalm 40, he and many other children talk of, like, Musawo was the name they gave me. It's the medical person word in that language. You say, Musawo, we have taken your verse, Psalm 40, and we see that God has taken us from our pit and put our feet on a rock and given us a new song to sing. And in 2018, Dan he told me that God was leading him and guiding him to be a pastor. And so Smithton Church in Inverness, my home church, was able to help provide his fees and help him in that journey. And last year he finished his degree in theology. And from a pastor who loves the Lord, he carries no shame about the years, the redeeming God that can redeem even the darkest pit from the streets. So that's a wonderful story. That I want to be careful. It's not rose-tinted glasses. There was also, again, like India, very difficult times. But I want to speak of both the reality of the darkness, but the light of the Lord that shines in these darkest times. And in 2021, it became clear that I had been coming home to help care for my mum, and I left the ministry. I had handed over the medical work and the child protection work and the counselling work that I'd been involved in, caring for Mum for her last months of life until she passed away in December. A privilege, but as you can imagine, difficult as well. And last year, my newsletter began with the title, A New Dawn on a New Day, on a New Year and a New Season. And this is now that I'm going to speak about the work of pioneers. There are leaflets at the back, well, when you come in, at the back of the church as we are here. They're a new organization, I recognize, to many people, but when you get to know them, they work in over 100 countries in the world with a real priority to really pioneer into some of the most difficult places in the world. They have a focus on the poorest of the poor. They have a focus on the unreached or the underreached, the difficult to reach. So I don't have much time, but we can speak more about pioneers. We were exploring out of these 104 countries where God was going to lead me. We were exploring for some time some options in the Middle East, but God opened this door for Bolivia. And there's another verse that's very important to me, that when God opens a door, nobody can shut it. That's Revelation 3, which says, "See, I have set before you an open door." So let me tell you a little bit about the work of pioneers. So for your geography, sorry if I move away from the mic, I guess. I really recognize I'm speaking to an international community, and we have brothers and sisters from the beautiful continent of South America. This is my first time to ever set foot in this stunning, stunning continent. But if you're not familiar with South America, there it is there. South America in the bottom left. Bolivia is to the left of Brazil, the south of Peru. These are usually countries that we're more familiar with. And then Bolivia there, landlocked, and Sucre is the capital city. Next slide, please. So just a few things to mention about Bolivia, two particularly on this slide. The ethnic diversity is important because I'm going to be speaking particularly about the title there, Native Americans or indigenous descendants of the Inca. They're different in lots of different ways to the European descent Bolivians, or mestizo, are the word for mixed. So, and the other part to really highlight there is that Bolivia is the poorest country in South America, and I'm going to speak a little bit more about that. So like I say, the Quechuan people are the people group that I'm going out with pioneers to serve them, to reach them. Pioneers have been working in Bolivia and other places in South America for some time. The Quechuan people are really interesting. I have a special love of anthropology. That's the study of people groups. And especially as a Celtic person, as I mentioned, we come from a farming, crofting community, small villages, and farming is a main part of our culture as well. And that resonates. It did in Africa with some of the Bantu communities that we were reaching, but also the Nilotic, the cattle-keeping people. They were really surprised that a Scottish person knew how to milk a cow. They would say to me, white people, they don't dig for potatoes. And I was like, tell my dad that. That's how we grew up, digging potatoes and shearing sheep. And they're like, what? You guys, you don't just go to Tesco's and buy these things. Very colorful people group in many ways. Next slide, please. So Sucre is the capital. Some of you may be familiar with La Paz in Bolivia. La Paz has the seat of government and administration, but the actual official capital is Sucre. One thing to note, I was there in November, December, and the high altitude is something very significant, and I'll be asking for prayer towards the end of my talk, but please remember that it's not an easy environment. The two pictures that I took there just show something of the contrast. South America has a strong influence with the Roman Catholic Church, and those influences are very obvious in the capital there. But also a European, kind of a beautiful, like open squares and some lovely architecture. But the Quechuan people are in some ways discriminated. The indigenous language they speak is very different to Spanish. I think it sounds beautiful. I'm going to speak a little on that as well. Next slide. So pioneers, like I say, have been working in Bolivia for some time. Greg Muir is the Canadian team leader on the left, and his wife is Lily on the far right. She's Bolivian. They've been serving God in Bolivia through a radio ministry to reach the Quechuan. So there are little radios about this size that have solar panels on the back so they can charge the batteries. They have been able to get thousands of these radios high up in a mountain range. I don't know if the boys and girls know that God has named a mountain range in South America after your own minister. Did anyone know that? The Andes. The Quechuan people live up in actually, that went down well. Last Sunday, I was with Andy Pearson and they all send their love in St. Peter's, Dundee. He was a previous minister to here, if those who don't know. He's also called Andy, So Colin and the children, they all liked that wee quip. So they've been able to get radios high up in the Andes. It's difficult to reach. Again, a principle of pioneers to go into some of these areas, or deep into the Amazon. So this ministry has been really blessed by God to reach the Quechuan people. But what they've recognized, they work with the Evangelical Baptist Church. That's who pioneers partner with in Bolivia. And there has been growing concern from pioneers and from the Bolivian church that there are growing numbers of children from the Quechuan people group on the streets of the capital. And there is no current ministry there. So that's what I've been asked to be a part of, to work together with the church to help develop a ministry to these children. Next slide, please. Now, the next is a 30-second video clip. Now, growing up where I grew up, I was told officially that Gaelic was the language of heaven. It just shows that when you have an indigenous language, it means a lot. Like, God can speak to us in that way. Again, speaking to an international audience here, that will not be a surprise to those of you who are non-English first language. The language of Gaelic, God has used to speak to me when I first became a Christian, and continues to in its own way. The Quechuan language that you're going to hear is so different to Spanish, but it's so beautiful. There's indigenous musical instruments that you're going to hear as well. This is a Quechuan church that has been there for 2 years. They were celebrating that Sunday I was there with them. It was a 2-year anniversary. You will see that it's not a church building like we know, and particularly a stunning building like this. But being part of global mission is a privilege to be with so many people groups around the world. Even in Africa, I had the privilege to worship God with Sudanese believers in South Sudan. I've been in DRC Congo, Central Africa Republic. I used to try and help, like there was child soldiers or trafficked children. There was work that I was involved in. Again, India, Nepal. I've been out in Malaysia, just different countries in Africa and around the world. It's such a privilege. So I hope you will enjoy this little taste of heaven, because God said that heaven is going to be made up of every tribe and nation and language worshiping him.
Also, apologies, you might have to do the same again later.
Maybe we'll have to wait till heaven to hear that, but that's okay. That's okay. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to speak now about one of my favorite subjects. I've been speaking about God and his mission, his global mission, but to speak about children and the joy and the privilege that it is to be a part of their lives around the world. And no surprises to anybody that knows that God works by the Holy Spirit, but Andy just about copied a list that I'm going to say to you in his prayer that he prayed for me earlier. There is a list that I have, that this is a new organization. It's a new country to me. It's a new continent. It's a new people group, a new language. It's a new team. It's a new ministry. It's new challenges, but there's new blessings and there's new opportunities. But he also mentioned the other column that I have, which if all that first column feels daunting and overwhelming and themes that you'll hear more about if you hear more and more about my life and about global mission. But to remember that the foundation of all of this is that this is the same God. This is the same gospel. This is the same mission that he has, the Great Commission to go out and make disciples. It's the same heart that God has for his children. the same heart that God has, particularly for the poor, for the disadvantaged, for the rejected. It's the same love that he has, and it's the same privilege and blessing to serve him. I mentioned Isaiah 58, especially with working with children. Isaiah 58, the first few verses, he's really rebuking people who are fasting and just doing it for the show. But I want to concentrate on verses 6 and 7 on to 12, because God tells us to share our food with the hungry. It's very, very clear. There are some things that take some time to unpack, but that one is so clear, like share our food with the hungry, clothe the naked, provide the poor wanderer with shelter. These are all things that are crucial to frontline ministry with children on the streets and global mission. But please note with me that it has been so powerful that before he says all of those things, obviously important, but the first thing he says is, loose the chains of injustice. So that's something I want to leave with you as well, as you hear about what God is doing. Be encouraged, but also be challenged on how we, as the body of Christ, can really engage with the global injustices that are contributing to why children are on the streets anywhere in the world, our city here and around the world. There are climate change issues, there's geopolitical issues. It's important that we all engage with these injustices and loose the chains of injustice. Next slide, please. So, before I speak a little bit partnering, I want to take time to thank you for all your partnerships. You're from the ministry team, the elders, the congregation. You have loved me and cared for me. A few years ago, 7 years ago, I was back in London to do a master's in global health, and again felt part of your fellowship. You have supported me and encouraged me and prayed for me, and I'm here to just give you so many thanks. If you would like to know more and partner in prayer and get my newsletters, there's little prayer cards at the back there. The email address is on the back, so you can sign up to get newsletters, so please feel free. There are partnership leaflets as well, if you feel led to be part of that. Because the biblical principle for global mission is that it's not like Marsali has a bright idea one day and just gets a flight somewhere, but that we are supposed to partner together so that we can be a mutual blessing and encouragement as well. So I am sent out by my church, my home church, but there is a real sense of the deputation that I've been doing over the last few months is that as the body of Christ, that we partner together in this. And not just for myself, but there's so many mission organizations and missionaries. And I know you love Paul and Helen, the shepherds, and what God is doing in their lives as well. But just thank you for the partnership you've already been involved in, and God willing, ahead as well. Next slide. So this is, just as I close, it's the final slide. I've taken quite a bit of time. I want to give thanks to God. The first one there, it's important to give thanks to what God has already done. Sometimes we're in a hurry to tell him all the new things we want to pray for, but I think it's important to give time to give thanks for all that God has done. And then pray. I would ask that God will receive all the glory and honor, and pray for all the logistics that are happening just now. This is one of my final talks over the last few months of traveling, and I'm going to take some leave in April, and then in May we're going to review and see where we are in the planning and the budgeting, and being able to maybe book flights to go out. Just as I close, if anybody does have any questions, I'm going to hand back over to Andy. And if people are a bit reluctant to ask questions, please know that having worked with children for over 30 years, I have a very high tolerance to questions. I get asked why my hair is short, why I'm wearing pink, why I'm fat, why I'm single. You can ask me just about anything. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you for staying behind. And I'll hand over to Andy now.